There is a detail in the book of Jeremiah that has been sitting in plain sight for more than 2,600 years. A man is dying in a cistern, mud at the bottom, no water. A prophet slowly disappearing while the most powerful religious and political leaders in Jerusalem either put him there or turned away and said nothing. And the one person who decided to act, who walked into the king's palace and named what was happening as evil, who thought carefully about whether the rescue ropes would cut into the prophet's skin on the way up. That person was African. Most black Christians in America have never heard a sermon about him. What makes that story hard to find is not that anyone locked it away. The tradition built around these texts, shaped by specific historical forces that scholars have carefully documented, consistently moved past certain details without stopping. Certain figures got mentioned once and left behind. Certain words got translated inconsistently across centuries. Certain passages received extended commentary and certain ones got a footnote and a quiet transition to the next point. The result is a version of the biblical story smaller than the story the text itself tells. In this video, we read the larger version. 7 recurring patterns, traceable across multiple books written across multiple centuries, connected to a specific geographic and cultural heritage, supported and discussed by named scholars whose work is verifiable. 7 patterns of courage, clarity, wisdom, presence, searching, preservation, and reaching, always there, waiting for a reader willing to slow down. That reader is you. There is a question that lives underneath a lot of other questions in the black church in America. It does not always get spoken directly. It surfaces in the pauses during sermons, in the way certain conversations about faith trail off without resolution, in the specific exhaustion that comes not from doubting God, but from trying to reconcile a God you genuinely believe in with a history that seems to push back against everything that belief should mean. When it finally comes to the surface, it usually sounds something like this. If God sees everyone equally, if God made everyone equally, if God loves everyone equally, then where exactly was God during 400 years of what happened to us? That is a real question. It deserves a real engagement, not a dismissal dressed in theological language. And the first thing that needs to be said about it is this. The pain behind that question is not a sign of weak faith. It is a sign of honest faith, the kind that refuses to pretend, the kind that insists on bringing the full weight of lived experience into contact with what it believes and will not accept comfort that costs nothing to offer. But here is something that also needs to be said honestly. The question, as most people carry it, already contains an assumption that shapes every answer before the search even begins. The assumption is that suffering is the defining story, that what was done to a people is the central fact about that people, that the most important question to ask about black identity and Christian faith is how to explain the gap between what God claims to be and what history delivered. Start from that assumption and every answer will be filtered through it before you have read a single verse. What happens when you start somewhere different? What happens when, instead of beginning with the suffering and working backward toward the text, you begin with the text itself and follow where it actually goes? When you read carefully, when you trace a specific identity through dozens of appearances across multiple books, when you pay attention to who is named, where they appear in the narrative structure, what they do at the moments that matter most, when you ask not what was done to this heritage, but what this heritage consistently does in the pages of the Bible, you find something that the question about suffering, for all its honesty and all its weight, was never quite positioned to show you. You find patterns, not a triumphalist counter-narrative assembled to make people feel good by swapping one oversimplification for another. Actual patterns, recurring across centuries, traceable across multiple books, Discussed and framed by scholars working in different traditions across different decades, patterns of a people appearing at specific moments with a specific quality of presence that the ancient writers felt compelled to record, and the text has refused to let disappear. Now, before we go any further, something foundational needs to be said clearly. Because this video makes claims about the biblical text, and those claims need a framework that is honest about what they are and what they are not. When we trace a Cushite-Ethiopian-North African presence in Scripture, we are tracking a specific geographic and cultural identity documented in the original Hebrew and Greek texts. We are not claiming that every person of African descent in America today is a direct genealogical descendant of the biblical Cushite people in a traceable linear sense. The African diaspora in America came from many different regions, many different ethnic communities, many different histories. Collapsing all of that into a single biblical lineage would be both historically inaccurate and disrespectful to the genuine diversity within the community. What we are doing is something more honest and ultimately more meaningful. We are tracing a recurring presence in Scripture, a presence that is African by geographic location, a presence that appears at decisive moments with patterns worth examining carefully. And we are asking what those patterns might mean for anyone whose heritage connects to the African continent, broadly and in all its diversity. Colin, In the Forging of Races, Race, Scripture, and the Protestant Atlantic World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2006. Documents how interpretive choices accumulated across generations to produce a tradition that consistently made African presence in Scripture less visible than the text itself would support. His argument is not about conspiracy or coordinated deception. It is about accumulation, about what gets sermon time and what gets moved past, about which figures receive extended commentary and which ones appear in footnotes and disappear before the congregation has had a chance to sit with them. David Goldenberg. In The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, published by Princeton University Press in 2003. Established with careful scholarship that the racial reading of the so-called Hamitic curse was not in the original text. It was constructed and applied centuries after the text was written, to serve purposes that had nothing to do with what the biblical writers intended. That construction did not just affect how people read Genesis chapter 9. It created a pull on the entire interpretive tradition, making it harder to slow down for the African figures the text actually celebrates. Howard Thurman. In Jesus and the Disinherited, published by Beacon Press in 1949, described what happens when people read Scripture with their backs against the wall. A quality of spiritual directness, a refusal to accept easy answers, a grip on the text that forces you deeper than comfort would ever take you. The Black Church chose to hold on across 400 years of pressure, and in holding on, it found things that the tradition around it was not emphasizing. In this video, we look at those things directly. 7 recurring patterns, discussed and framed by named scholars across multiple academic traditions, present in the same Bible that has been sitting on your shelf your entire life, not hidden by anyone in a dramatic or coordinated sense, consistently overlooked by a tradition shaped by forces we can now name and examine, and available right now to anyone willing to read more carefully than they were taught to read. That is the invitation. And the first step is a single word. I want you to try something before we look at the text. Think about what it feels like to read a story where you cannot find yourself. Not a story that excludes you through hostility. Something quieter and in some ways harder to name. A story where every significant moment happens somewhere other than where your people are from. Where the geography that matters is always somewhere else. where you read from beginning to end and finish without ever encountering a reflection of your own heritage at the moments that carry the most weight. Now think about what it feels like to discover that you were reading with the wrong map. That discovery is what this chapter is about. And it begins with one word: Cushite. In the original Hebrew, Cushite is a geographic and ethnic identifier, not a poetic image, not a spiritual metaphor, an address. When the biblical writers use this word, they were giving the reader concrete information about where a person came from and who their people were. Cush referred to the region south of Egypt, the territory that corresponds roughly to modern Nubia and Sudan, with cultural and geographic connections extending into the broader Horn of Africa. A real place, a significant place, a place with its own history, its own kingdoms, its own cultural traditions that the ancient Near Eastern world knew and recognized as consequential. Now here is what most readers were never taught to notice. Open to the opening book of your Bible, Genesis chapter 2. Before any covenant, before any patriarch, before the Exodus and the law at Sinai, before any of the moments Western Christianity tends to treat as the real beginning of the story, the text describes the world at its origin. 4 rivers flow out of Eden. 2 of them are the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers you can find on any map today. And the 4th river, the Gihon, is described in specific terms as the river that flows around the whole land of Cush. Cush. In the opening description of where everything began, the writers of Genesis, when they were painting the landscape of human origin, included this land in that picture, not as a footnote, not as a later addition. Alongside the Tigris and Euphrates, in the description of where the rivers of Eden flowed, Africa was not brought into the biblical story at some later historical moment. It was written into the geography of where the story starts. John H. Walton, an Old Testament scholar at Wheaton College, in The Lost World of Genesis 1, published by IVP Academic in 2009, argues that Genesis is primarily a text about function, purpose, and order. When the writers mapped the rivers of Eden, they were describing the world as they understood it in terms of significance. And in that map, the land of the Cushite people has a place at the very beginning. Now move to Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations. Most readers move through this quickly on the way to the Abraham narrative. But stop here and read the structure carefully, because something deliberate is happening in how the writer arranged the names. Among Ham's descendants, listed in verse 6, the first name is Cush, not somewhere in the middle, not after more familiar names. First, Umberto Cassuto, the Italian Hebrew scholar whose commentary on Genesis, published by Magnus Press, remains one of the most detailed linguistic analyses of the text available, discusses how the arrangement of names in Hebrew genealogies reflects the writer's understanding of significance and priority. Position in the list is not random. What is named first is a signal. And then, just when you think the Table of Nations is simply a genealogy to be scanned and moved past, the text stops to introduce someone, Nimrod, the son of Cush. The text describes him as the first great ruler on earth, a mighty warrior, a builder of cities, the founder of the first named empire in the entire biblical record, before any pharaoh is named, before any Israelite king. The first person in the Bible described as building a kingdom and filling it with cities is the grandson of Ham and the son of Cush. Let that sit for a moment. The first empire builder in the biblical record carries the Cushite lineage, and most people who have read Genesis their entire lives were never taught to stop there. Now here is the piece that changes how you follow the Cushite identity through the rest of the Bible. The word Cushite appears throughout the Hebrew text, from Genesis through the prophets. Across multiple books written across multiple centuries, but across centuries of English translation it was handled inconsistently. The King James Bible, published in 1611, translated Cushite as Ethiopian in many places. Other translations used Cushite. Some offered footnotes. Others offered nothing. A modern reader encountering the same identity described differently in different passages, with no explanation connecting them, would have no way of recognizing a coherent and continuous presence moving through the entire biblical story. Randall Bailey, a Hebrew Bible scholar whose work on African presence in the Old Testament has been published by the Society of Biblical Literature, has framed this as a consistent pattern in Western interpretation. The text placed these references prominently. The tradition around the text decided not to linger. But here is what changes when you have the word. Once you know that the Cushite woman in Numbers chapter 12 and Ebed-Melech in Jeremiah chapter 38 and the official from Ethiopia in Acts chapter 8 and the worshippers in Zephaniah chapter 3 are all connected by the same geographic and cultural thread, you stop seeing isolated references and start seeing what they actually are. A portrait. Drawn not by one writer in one book, but by multiple writers across multiple centuries who kept returning to this people at the moments that mattered most. That portrait has 7 recurring patterns, and the first one is drawn in a cistern. Before we go to the cistern, we need to understand what Jerusalem had become by the time we reach Jeremiah chapter 38. Not the Jerusalem of David's early reign, not the Jerusalem of the temple dedication. The Jerusalem of Jeremiah chapter 38 is a city in the final stages of a long, slow collapse. The Babylonian army is outside the walls. Food is running out. The leadership has spent years making choices that the prophet Jeremiah told them again and again would lead to exactly this moment. And now the moment has arrived. And the people with the most institutional authority in the city are responding the way people with institutional authority often respond when their choices have produced disaster. They are looking for someone to blame. Jeremiah had been delivering prophetic messages for years, and those messages had a consistent and unwelcome theme. The city would fall. The resistance to Babylon was the wrong strategy. Consequences were coming for choices made across generations. For saying these things, he had been beaten, imprisoned, and put in stocks. And now a group of officials came to King Zedekiah with a request that reveals exactly what kind of leadership Jerusalem had in its final hour. Let this man be put to death. He is weakening the soldiers and the people. He is not seeking their welfare but their harm. They wanted to execute a prophet for telling the truth. And King Zedekiah, the king of Jerusalem, the man whose entire role existed to exercise judgment and protect his people, gave this answer. He is in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you. Sit with that sentence. The king of Jerusalem, a palace full of officials, soldiers at his command, and his response to a request to murder a prophet is, I cannot stop you. The officials lowered Jeremiah into the cistern. No water, only mud at the bottom. And as the text describes it, Jeremiah sank into the mud. Not metaphor. A man slowly dying while the entire apparatus of religious and political authority in Jerusalem either ordered it or washed their hands of it. Now look at what the text does next. And listen carefully. When Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern. Stop before he does anything. Hold that phrase. When he heard. Not when he was officially notified. Not when someone with appropriate seniority decided to bring the matter to his attention through proper channels. When he heard. The way you hear about something happening nearby that you were not supposed to be part of. He heard about it the way anyone hears about something that then requires them to decide what to do with what they now know. He was a eunuch in a foreign court. His entire social position depended on the favor of the people around him. The men who had just convinced the king to approve a murder were not minor officials. They had demonstrated, in real time, exactly what they were willing to do and exactly how far their influence reached. And Ebed-Melech went to the king. Not quietly. Not through a private back channel designed to raise the concern without risking anything personal. He went to the Benjamin Gate, one of the main public gathering spaces of Jerusalem, where people could hear every word he said. And here is what he said. "My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the cistern, and he will die there of hunger, for there is no bread left in the city." He named it, out loud, in public, in front of witnesses who included the people he was accusing, not a diplomatically softened concern, not a carefully worded suggestion designed to let everyone save face. These men have done evil, the word that fit the action, used in the place where people could hear it. Now think about what made that possible. Not bravery in the abstract, something more specific. Clarity. The capacity to look directly at what was happening when every person with more institutional standing had decided that looking directly at it was not something they were willing to do. The king had looked and said, "I can do nothing." The priests had looked and said nothing. The religious and political establishment of Jerusalem had arrived at their various forms of silence. Ebed-Melech looked at the same situation and saw it for what it was. The king listened. He gave Ebed-Melech 30 men and the authority to act. And then Ebed-Melech did something the text preserved for more than 2,600 years. Not because it was logistically necessary, but because it reveals who he actually was beneath the surface of the action. Before he lowered any ropes into the cistern, he sent someone to find old rags and worn-out clothes. He carried them to the edge himself. And he told Jeremiah to put them under his arms, between his skin and the ropes, so that the ropes would not cut into him on the way up. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. At a moment when he had every practical reason to focus exclusively on getting a man out of a hole in the ground before anyone changed their mind, he stopped and thought about pain that did not have to happen and decided to prevent it. The rescue could have happened without the rags. No one required them. No one would have noticed their absence. He brought them anyway. There is a kind of courage that acts when acting is dangerous. That is rare enough. But there is a rarer kind that acts and also stops to ask how to do it gently. The text kept both in the same story because they belong together. They are both part of who this man was. Kathleen O'Connor. In Jeremiah, Pain and Promise, published by Fortress Press in 2011, describes Ebed-Melech as a counter-narrative within the book, an outsider who acts with greater integrity than every insider at the most critical moment in the entire story. John Bright, in his commentary on Jeremiah in the Anchor Bible series, notes the literary significance of this episode as a moment of moral clarity within what is otherwise a pervasive portrait of institutional collapse. Now, look at what happens in chapter 39, verses 15 through 18. While Jeremiah is still confined, before the city has even fallen, God delivers a personal word through Jeremiah specifically for Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian. Not for the king who said he could do nothing, not for the priests who chose silence, not for the officials who ordered the pit, for the man from Africa in a foreign palace who heard something and moved when every person with more power and more standing chose to look away. I will deliver you on that day. You shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid, for I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword. But you shall have your life as a prize of war, because you have put your trust in me. Because you have put your trust in me. Not because of his title, not because of his position, because of what he did at the exact moment when doing it cost something real and everyone around him with more authority chose something easier. The book of Jeremiah is 52 chapters long. It moves through kings and priests and false prophets and soldiers and the slow, terrible collapse of a civilization. And in those 52 chapters, very few individuals receive a personal word of divine protection like this one. The ones who do are people the text identifies as having acted in faithfulness at a moment when faithfulness was genuinely costly. One of them is an Ethiopian man in a foreign palace who thought about the ropes. If you have ever been the only person in a room willing to name what was actually happening, while everyone around you with more credentials and more institutional standing quietly decided that silence was the safer choice. You already know something from the inside about what Ebed-Melech carried into that conversation at the Benjamin Gate. The first pattern in this text is not superhuman courage. It is a specific kind of clarity. The capacity to see what is actually happening when the people with the most power have the most reasons to look away. And then, to move from that clarity even when moving is costly. The text kept his name. God noticed him personally. And now, after more than 2,600 years, so do you? There is a conflict in Numbers chapter 12 that rarely receives extended pulpit time. And when you understand what it is actually about, you will wonder why. Before we read what the conflict is, I need to tell you who is raising it. Because the identity of the person raising it matters enormously to the weight of everything that follows. Miriam is not a character introduced here for the first time. By Numbers chapter 12, she has already been established as one of the most celebrated figures in the Exodus narrative. She is called a prophetess in Exodus chapter 15. She led the women of Israel in worship after the crossing of the Red Sea, one of the most iconic moments in the entire Old Testament. And in Micah chapter 6, verse 4, she is named alongside Moses and Aaron as one of 3 leaders God specifically sent before the people during the Exodus. One of 3. A named co-leader of the entire movement. There is also a genuine scholarly debate about the identity of the woman at the center of this conflict. And I want to address it before the narrative builds. Because intellectual honesty is not optional in this video. The text tells us Moses married a Cushite woman, a woman from the region south of Egypt. 2 main scholarly positions exist about who she was. The first holds that she is Zipporah, the Midianite woman Moses married in Exodus chapter 2, and that the Cushite identifier is used here in a descriptive sense. Several respected commentators across different traditions have held this view. The second position, held by a significant number of scholars, is that this is a different woman entirely. A second wife whose Cushite identity is her primary identifier in the context of what follows. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2, describes a tradition of Moses having married a woman from Ethiopia during an earlier period of his life. Josephus is not a biblical text. He is a historical source reflecting traditions circulating in the 1st century of the Common Era. But his account shows that the idea of Moses having an African wife was part of the interpretive conversation around Moses for at least 2,000 years before any contemporary discussion raised it. Will Gafney, in Womanist Midrash, published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2017, discusses this passage as a moment of narrative protection for a woman whose identity has become the explicit source of a conflict she did not start. Now, with that foundation established, read verse 1 of Numbers chapter 12. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. Read it again. The same fact stated twice in the same sentence. In Hebrew literary practice, this kind of immediate repetition is not redundancy. It is the ancient equivalent of underlining. The writer is stopping you before the story moves forward and saying, "This detail, right here, carry it with you into everything that follows." This is what the conflict is actually about. Do not let it become invisible. The conflict begins because of who a specific woman is. Not what she did, not what she said, not a theological disagreement or a political dispute. Who she is, her identity, her origin, the fact that she is there. Now look at what happens. God calls Moses, Miriam, and Aaron to the tent of meeting. The divine presence descends in a pillar of cloud. God speaks directly. The speech defends Moses and rebukes those who challenged him. When the cloud lifts, Miriam is struck with a serious skin condition. The conflict began with a challenge to the Cushite woman's presence. It ends with a divine response directed entirely at the people who raised the challenge. And notice carefully what does not happen anywhere in this passage. The Cushite woman is never called to explain herself, never asked to justify her presence, never required to demonstrate that she belongs where she is. God does not ask her to make a case. The challenge was raised about her, and God responded to the challenge before she had to say a single word in her own defense. That is a specific narrative choice. The writer could have shown her defending herself. Instead, the text shows God responding before any such defense was necessary. There is an experience that many black Christians know from the inside. Walking into a space where your presence itself becomes the disruption, where you have not done anything except arrive, where the discomfort in the room has nothing to do with your actions or your words and everything to do with your identity, your background, your being there, and where the people with institutional authority signal, in ways direct or indirect, that the problem they are responding to is you. Numbers chapter 12 does not make that experience stop hurting. What it does is show you, in specific and unmistakable terms, how the God of the biblical text responded when that exact dynamic was placed directly in front of him. He did not ask her to justify herself. He did not require her to prove she belonged. He responded. Before she could say a single word. The second pattern is not the pattern of never facing the challenge. The challenge came, raised by one of the most respected figures in the entire Exodus narrative. The pattern is something deeper. It is the capacity to exist in a space without requiring the space to validate your existence. A presence that draws from something the external structures of the room cannot grant and therefore cannot revoke. The Cushite woman never speaks in Numbers chapter 12. She does not need to. And the text preserved that silence for more than 2,600 years. Not as absence, as dignity. There is a story in 1 Kings chapter 10 that almost every preacher has used at some point, and almost every time it gets used, the most interesting thing about it gets quietly left behind. The Queen of Sheba visits Solomon. Gold is mentioned. Spices are mentioned. Solomon answers questions impressively. The sermon finds what it came for and moves on. The queen becomes a supporting character in a story about Solomon's greatness, a witness to someone else's achievement. But that is not what the text says. And when you read 1 Kings chapter 10 slowly, paying attention to the specific words the writer chose and the specific structure of the exchange they described, you find a story about a woman who did not travel thousands of miles to validate anyone. Verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Stop at that word. Test. The Hebrew word is nasah. It appears in some of the most significant testing moments in the entire Old Testament, including when Abraham was tested in Genesis chapter 22. It carries the weight of rigorous examination under real conditions. This is not the language of a courtesy visit. This is not the language of someone who has already decided to be impressed. This is the language of someone who has formed a standard and is coming to see if reality measures up to it. And the questions she brings are described by a word meaning difficult riddles and complex intellectual challenges. She did not travel a significant distance with polite conversation. She brought demanding content ready for serious engagement. She had formed a judgment. She came to apply it. The text tells us Solomon answered all her questions. And then she delivers her assessment. Listen to the structure carefully because it is doing something worth noticing. The report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpassed the report that I heard. Read that structure. She came with prior information. She had already formed a judgment based on that information. She applied her own standard when she arrived. And she updated her assessment honestly when the evidence exceeded her prior estimate. That is not flattery. A flatterer says what the powerful person wants to hear, regardless of the evidence. What the Queen of Sheba said is the opposite. She is saying she had a real standard. She applied it rigorously. And reality exceeded it. That is the response of someone who takes her own judgment seriously enough to revise it when revision is genuinely warranted. The text presents her not as Solomon's admirer but as his intellectual peer, a person who arrived prepared to evaluate and chose to honor what she genuinely found worthy of honor. Now look at what follows. The text records that she gave Solomon 120 talents of gold and spices in quantity the writer describes as historically singular, a level of abundance that had not come before. As the text records it, she did not bring a symbolic gesture. She brought a statement about what she believed the encounter was genuinely worth. And Solomon gave to her all that she desired. Whatever she asked. The exchange was equal. She brought what she chose to bring. She received what she chose to ask for. The text records all of it without a single qualification about who she is or where she comes from. Now here is where careful scholarship matters. Because the geographic question is genuine and deserves a straight answer. The location of Sheba has been debated by scholars across generations. One major position places Sheba in the ancient kingdom of Saba in what is now Yemen, where there is significant archaeological evidence for a powerful Sabaean kingdom. A second position connects Sheba to the Horn of Africa, pointing to Sabaean cultural influences documented in the archaeological record of northern Ethiopia and to ancient trading connections across the Red Sea. Edward Ullendorff, in Ethiopia and the Bible, published by the British Academy in 1968, argues that the geographic identity of Sheba overlapped both sides of the Red Sea in ancient usage, and that the sharp boundary we draw today between the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa did not exist as a cultural or ethnic line in the ancient world. The honest answer is that certainty about exactly which side of the Red Sea this queen came from is not available from the current evidence. Claiming more certainty than the evidence supports would undermine the intellectual honesty this video requires. It is also important to say clearly that the Ethiopian tradition about this queen is preserved in a text called the Kebra Nagast. This is a medieval Ethiopian text compiled in its current form in the 14th century, drawing on earlier traditions. It is not a biblical text. It is not a historical document in the modern scholarly sense. It is one of the most significant foundational narrative texts of Ethiopian civilization, central to Ethiopian national and religious identity for centuries. And it deserves to be understood accurately for what it is, rather than either inflated into historical proof or dismissed as culturally irrelevant. What is not in debate is what the canonical text itself shows. A woman of extraordinary wealth and political authority. A head of state who initiates an international journey entirely on her own terms. An intellectual who arrives with a demanding standard already formed and applies it without softening it for the occasion. A person who gives from a position of genuine strength and receives on equal terms. A figure the text presents with the full dignity of a peer. without qualification, without any suggestion that her identity requires explanation or defense. Now think about what this model actually looks like in practice. Not a passive model. Not a model defined by waiting for someone else to initiate. A woman who decided what she wanted to know, who went to find out, who brought her own standard to the encounter rather than deferring to someone else's account of their own greatness, who updated her estimate honestly when the evidence demanded it, who gave generously from strength and received on equal terms. The third pattern is the pattern of taking your own questions seriously enough to pursue them across the distance they require, of arriving at the encounter prepared, of applying your own standard with the kind of intellectual honesty that neither inflates what it finds nor diminishes it, of engaging as a peer rather than as a spectator. She decided the conversation needed to happen. She showed up prepared. And she went home knowing exactly what she had found and what it was genuinely worth. There is a verse in the Gospel of Mark that most people have heard read aloud more times than they can count without ever stopping at the detail that changes everything about it. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Most teaching stops at the act. A man is compelled. The wait, the road, the moment of contact between an ordinary person going about his day and the most consequential event in the gospel narrative, that is usually where the reflection ends and the story continues toward Golgotha. But look at what Mark does immediately after giving you Simon's name. He does not move on. In a gospel famous among New Testament scholars for its speed and compression, a gospel that moves faster than any other and strips away detail rather than adding it, Mark pauses the narrative to give you the names of this man's children, Alexander and Rufus. Two specific names, attached to a man who appears in a single verse and is never mentioned again in the gospel itself. Why would a writer known for economy stop here and do this? In ancient literary practice, names were included in a narrative when the audience receiving that narrative was expected to already know them. When a writer identified someone by their family relationships, it was because those family members were recognizable to the people first reading or hearing the text. Mark's gospel was written for a specific community, most likely in Rome. In the decades after the resurrection, when Mark writes the father of Alexander and Rufus, he is not providing biographical background for strangers. He is using familiar names to anchor an unfamiliar detail about their family origin. He is saying to his original audience, you already know who these two men are. This is their father. This is what happened to him on that road. Alexander and Rufus were known figures in the early Christian community that first received this gospel. Now, establish where Simon came from. Cyrene was a major city on the northern coast of Africa, in the territory that corresponds to modern Libya. A man from Cyrene was a man from North Africa. That geographic identity is the first thing Mark tells you about Simon after his name. And when you follow that North African identity through the rest of the New Testament, something becomes visible that a single verse cannot show you on its own. Acts chapter 2, verse 10. Among those present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, the text specifically includes people from Cyrene. The North African community was present at the moment Christianity was born as a movement. When the Holy Spirit was poured out and the gospel began its outward movement, Acts chapter 6, verse 9, a synagogue of the Cyrenians is specifically mentioned in Jerusalem, an established, organized community with its own dedicated place of worship in the city where Christianity was being born. Acts chapter 13, verse 1. The church at Antioch was the most strategically significant early Christian community outside Jerusalem. the launching point for the missionary movement that would carry the gospel across the Mediterranean world. Among the prophets and teachers listed there by name is Lucius of Cyrene, a North African man among the named leaders at the church that sent Paul on his first missionary journey. Now look at Romans chapter 16. Verse 13. Paul writes to the church in Rome and includes this: "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord. Also, his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." There is a Rufus in Rome whom Paul knows personally, whose mother Paul describes with the language of family, not a passing acquaintance, a relationship long enough and close enough that Paul reached for the word mother to describe what this woman had been to him. Is this the same Rufus whose father carried the cross? James Dunn, in his commentary on Romans in the Word Biblical Commentary series, acknowledges the possibility while being clear that certainty is not available from the current evidence. The connection is historically plausible, fits the geographic and social context of the early Roman Church, and has been considered seriously by scholars. It belongs in the category of genuinely possible rather than confirmed, and that honest distinction matters. Now here is what I want you to feel when you hold all of this together. Simon did not choose to be on that road. He was a man going about his day, who was pulled into the center of history without asking to be there. In that circumstance, the most natural outcome would have been for him to become a footnote, an unnamed bystander in someone else's account, a detail that gets noted once and disappears. But the text refused to let that happen. It stopped and named him. It named his sons. It placed his community at Pentecost and at Antioch. It carried his family story into Paul's most theologically significant letter. And every time the North African thread could have faded into the background of the early church story, the text pulled it back into view. The fourth pattern is not the pattern of choosing your moment. Simon did not choose his. The pattern is what happens after the moment. A people whose presence at the center gets recorded, remembered, and carried forward in the story long after the moment itself has passed. Whose names stay in the text. Whose community stays woven into the narrative of how Christianity came to be. A North African man's shoulders carried the cross at the hinge point of history, and the text made absolutely sure you knew his name and where he came from. When you think about how the gospel spread in the book of Acts, what direction does your mind go? Most people picture west, Jerusalem to Antioch, Antioch to Greece, Greece to Rome. That arc was drawn in Sunday school classrooms and confirmed in sermon after sermon across generations of American Christian education. The gospel moved west, toward Europe, and that westward movement was presented, implicitly or explicitly, as the primary story. But Acts chapter 8 is in your Bible. It comes before any of the famous westward journeys, before Paul's first missionary journey, before Greece and Macedonia and Rome appear on the mission map at all. In the narrative sequence Luke constructed, Acts chapter 8 comes first, and Acts chapter 8 goes south. Philip, one of the 7 deacons appointed in Acts chapter 6, is directed by a messenger to go toward the road from Jerusalem down to Gaza, south. And on that road he encounters a man, Luke, one of the most intentional and precise writers in the entire New Testament, describes this man with a specificity that was deliberate. Every detail was chosen, and the details build a portrait worth reading one layer at a time. He is Ethiopian. That is the first thing Luke tells you. Before his title, before his role, before anything else about who he is in the world, his nationality leads the description. He is an official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of all her treasury, not a portion of it, all of it. He controlled the financial apparatus of an entire kingdom. one of the most consequential administrative positions in a significant ancient government. He had come to Jerusalem to worship, not for trade, not for diplomacy. He made a long and difficult journey specifically to seek God. This man, with the resources of a kingdom at his disposal, it was hungry for something those resources could not give him. And he responded to that hunger the only way he knew how. He got up and went looking. And now he is heading home, sitting in his chariot, reading. Not just reading Isaiah chapter 53. This detail changes the entire texture of what follows. Isaiah chapter 53 is not a casual text. It is one of the most theologically searching passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. The suffering servant, a figure whose pain carries meaning beyond himself, whose wounds produce something for others that his own suffering alone cannot explain. Jewish and Christian interpreters have wrestled with this passage for centuries. You do not stumble into it on a slow afternoon. You go there because you are searching, because you have a sense, built up over time through questions that will not leave you alone, that somewhere in those verses is something you have been looking for. This man, on a dusty road home from a journey he made specifically to seek God, was reading that passage. Philip runs to the chariot. Do you understand what you are reading? And the Ethiopian official gives an answer that tells you exactly where he was in his journey. How can I? Unless someone guides me. That is not the response of someone encountering deep questions for the first time. It is the answer of a man who has been in the middle of a serious search long enough to know precisely where the search has brought him. He knows what he understands. He knows the shape of what he does not yet understand. And he is honest and hungry enough to say all of that to a stranger on a road. He invites Philip into the chariot. Now, feel what Philip actually found when he climbed up. He did not find a man who had never heard of God. He found a man who had already traveled to Jerusalem to worship, who was already reading one of the most profound prophetic texts in the Bible, who was already asking the right question about that text. The gospel came to this man not as introduction to a God he had never considered. It came as the completion of a search he had already been conducting for long enough to travel hundreds of miles in pursuit of it. Philip explained the text. He started with Isaiah chapter 53 and told him the good news about Jesus. The man received the explanation. He asked to be baptized. There is water right there by the road. Philip baptized him. And then Luke writes one final sentence about this man. The last thing he tells you, chosen carefully. The Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way rejoicing. He went on his way rejoicing. Back to Ethiopia, back to the court of Candace, back to his position controlling the treasury of a kingdom, not carrying a burden, carrying joy. Heading south with something he had been searching for long enough that finding it produced the kind of gladness Luke felt. The story was not complete without recording. Now there is a genuine scholarly debate here that deserves a straight answer. There is a real discussion among New Testament scholars about whether this Ethiopian official represents the first Gentile conversion recorded in Acts. The traditional position in much of Western Christianity holds that Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 represents that breakthrough moment, and that reading has a long history and is defensible. Acts chapter 10 is given significantly more narrative space, and Acts chapter 11 frames it as a pivotal development for Gentile inclusion. At the same time, Acts chapter 8 comes before Acts chapter 10 in the sequence Luke constructed. The most accurate statement is that this Ethiopian official is among the earliest named individuals to receive the gospel in a personal encounter as recorded in Acts. What is not in dispute is that Luke described him with extraordinary precision, chose every detail deliberately, and recorded as the final word about him that he went on his way rejoicing. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has read this moment as one of its foundational memories for more than 1,600 years. That church exists today. Tens of millions of members. Its own liturgical tradition in the ancient Ge'ez language. Its own theological identity developed across 16 centuries. A living institution that traces part of its roots to this road. This chariot. This man who went home rejoicing with something he had been searching for. That is not a legend preserved only in a book. That is a 1600-year-old institution alive right now. The fifth pattern is not the pattern of having everything figured out before the journey begins. This man did not have everything figured out. He had a scroll and a question, and the honesty to say out loud to a stranger that he needed help going further. The pattern is the posture underneath all of that. The willingness to pursue the question across the distance it requires. The willingness to keep reading even when the reading raises more questions. The willingness to say, I do not yet fully understand this and I want to. That is not weakness. That is the posture of someone already deep enough in a real search to know the difference between questions worth pursuing and questions worth setting down. Someone already oriented toward the answer, before the answer arrived with a name. The gospel moves south in Acts chapter 8. Before Rome. Before Greece. Before the famous journeys on the map most of us were handed, and the man who received it went on his way rejoicing. Most Christians in America grew up with a Bible containing 66 books. They were told, directly or by the shape of everything around them, that those 66 books represent the complete and recognized Word of God. Most people never questioned that number, never asked who decided it, when, or under what circumstances. Never asked whether communities of Christians in other parts of the world had made different decisions and kept reading different texts for reasons rooted in their own ancient and legitimate traditions. There is a community that made different decisions. That has been reading, copying, preserving, and teaching from a broader canon for more than 1600 years. And what that community kept, and what the physical evidence later showed about what they kept, is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire history of Christian scripture. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, before anything else. This needs to be established clearly. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest continuously existing Christian institutions on earth. Its roots trace to the 4th century of the Common Era, when Christianity became the official religion of the Aksumite Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world at that time. The Church has maintained unbroken institutional existence through the rise and fall of empires, through centuries of relative isolation from the rest of the Christian world, through the colonial era, through the 20th century, to the present day. Tens of millions of members. Its own theological tradition developed over 16 centuries. Its own liturgical language in the ancient Ge'ez language. Its own canon of Scripture, broader than the 66-book Western Protestant Bible, that it has never abandoned. That is historical documentation. Verifiable. Not in dispute. Now we need to talk honestly about how different Christian communities came to hold different canonical boundaries. Because the honest version of this history matters for understanding what the Ethiopian Church actually preserved and why. Different communities in different geographic and political situations made different decisions about which texts belonged in the canon across several centuries. Councils held in different regions established canonical lists, reflecting their own particular contexts at those particular moments. The Protestant Reformation led to further adjustments. The King James Bible, printed in 1611, settled on 66 books as the standard for most of Protestant Christianity. The Ethiopian Church was not represented at those councils in any meaningful capacity, and it did not accept their conclusions as binding on its own tradition. This is most accurately understood not as one side removing what another side preserved, but as different Christian communities with different histories making different canonical decisions that reflected their different contexts. That complexity deserves honest acknowledgement. What the Ethiopian Church did, with extraordinary consistency across 1600 years, was preserve its own canonical tradition. And here is where the story moves from historical observation into territory that physical evidence has since addressed in ways that cannot be dismissed. In 1947, ancient manuscripts were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in what is now Israel, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among those manuscripts were Aramaic fragments of a book called First Enoch. First Enoch is one of the texts in the Ethiopian canon. It is not in the 66-book Western Protestant Bible, but here is something that rarely gets mentioned alongside it. The New Testament book of Jude, in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, contains what most scholars understand as a direct quotation from First Enoch. The writer of Jude knew this text well enough, and regarded it seriously enough, to draw on it in a letter that became part of the New Testament. The quotation stayed in the canon. The book most scholars believe it came from did not make it into the Western canon, and the Ethiopian Church kept reading that book in continuous use for 1600 years, while much of the Western tradition set it aside. When the caves at Qumran were opened, the Aramaic fragments confirmed the antiquity of texts the Ethiopian Church had been preserving. Michael Knibb, a scholar of Second Temple Judaism at King's College London, whose work on the Aramaic fragments of First Enoch is among the most detailed in the field, has established that the Ethiopic text of First Enoch represents a careful and ancient transmission. His conclusion is textual rather than theological. The text preserved in the Ge'ez language across many centuries has genuine ancient roots. It reflects a tradition that predates the New Testament. Think about what that means practically. A church in northeastern Africa, scribes in generation after generation copying a text in an ancient language, preserving it through the rise and fall of empires, through centuries of isolation, through everything modernity brought with it. And then, excavations in the Judean desert yield Aramaic originals, and the text the Ethiopian Church had been keeping was confirmed as genuinely ancient. The same pattern holds for the Book of Jubilees, another text in the Ethiopian canon also found at Qumran. James Vanderkam, a scholar of Second Temple literature at the University of Notre Dame, whose work on Jubilees has appeared in multiple peer-reviewed publications, has established that Jubilees was a significant and widely read text in the period of Second Temple Judaism. The Ethiopian Church preserved it. The desert confirmed its antiquity. Now, intellectual honesty requires being clear about what this does and does not mean. This is not a claim that the Ethiopian canon is definitively correct and the Western canon is definitively wrong. Canon formation is a complex historical and theological question that scholars across multiple traditions have engaged seriously for centuries. That complexity deserves respect rather than a simple reversal of one tradition's conclusions. What this is something more specific and more verifiable. A church in northeastern Africa preserved ancient texts across 16 centuries in a living tradition of worship and theological identity. The physical evidence supported the antiquity of those texts, and as its canonical tradition reflects, this church read a story of the covenant in which the geography of Africa was woven into the narrative at foundational moments. From the rivers of Eden to the official going home rejoicing on the road to Gaza. Edward Ullendorff. In Ethiopia and the Bible, published by the British Academy in 1968, described the relationship between the Ethiopian Church and the biblical texts it preserved as one of the most significant and most underappreciated chapters in the history of Christian scripture. He was writing as a scholar of Semitic languages and Ethiopian culture, not as a theological advocate. And his conclusion was that this tradition deserves far more serious attention than it has historically received. The sixth pattern is not the pattern of institutional power. This church did not have the power of the councils that shaped the Western canon. It was not consulted when those decisions were made. It operated for long stretches in relative isolation from the centers of Western theological authority. But it kept reading. It kept copying. It kept preserving in a living language texts that much of the Christian world had moved past. It maintained a tradition that connected the rivers of Eden to the Cushite woman in Numbers, to Ebed-Melech in Jeremiah, to the official going home rejoicing in Acts. Reading the full thread without interruption across 16 centuries. And when the time came for those texts to be examined against physical evidence, the examination confirmed that what this community had been faithfully keeping was worth keeping. The tradition held, and the church that held it is still standing. We have now traced 5 specific figures and 1 ancient institution, each one placed at a moment that mattered, each one acting from a posture the ancient writers felt compelled to record and preserve. But there is something larger waiting that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see across multiple books and multiple centuries at the same time. Not a single figure, a portrait, drawn by writers working centuries apart, in different literary forms, addressing different historical situations, who nevertheless return to the Cushite people with the same consistent language again and again across texts that were never coordinated with each other. 3 passages form the center of this portrait. We need to read all 3 before we can see what they are showing together. The first is Psalm 68. Verse 31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. The verb translated as hasten does not describe reluctant eventual arrival. It carries urgency and intentional forward motion. A body already moving towards something before the signal to begin has been given, and the image attached to that motion, hands stretched out toward God, is not the image of a people waiting to be invited. It is the image of a people already in the posture of reaching, already extended, already committed to the direction before the surrounding world has caught up to them. The context of Psalm 68 matters here. This psalm opens with a declaration of God rising up and enemies scattering. It moves through images of God as defender of widows, father of the fatherless, the one who leads captives in triumph. Walter Brueggemann, in his extensive work on the Psalms, describes this kind of language as counter-narrative, a description of reality ordered by God's justice rather than by human empire, a different map of who matters and in which direction significance flows. And in the middle of that counter-narrative, Cush is named as one of the peoples moving forward in the procession, not being pulled forward reluctantly, not finally included after long delay, hastening, already in motion, hands already reaching. The second passage is Isaiah chapter 18. The prophet addresses a specific people with geographic precision, beyond the rivers of Cush, and then he describes them without softening. A nation tall and smooth-skinned, a people feared far and wide, powerful and aggressive, a nation whose land the rivers divide. This is not polite acknowledgement of a marginal people. This is a prophet of Israel looking at a specific people and describing what they actually are in the world: powerful, feared, consequential. And then in verse 7, the prophet describes where his vision sees them going: gifts brought to the Lord of hosts from this people, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. Scholars who have examined the original language note that the movement in that verse points toward voluntary offering rather than compelled tribute. This is not a defeated people paying what was extracted from them. This is a powerful people choosing to move toward God with intention, bringing what they chose to bring, arriving where they chose to go. The third passage is Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 10. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. Two phrases carry more weight than their size suggests. My worshippers, God speaking. The possessive is direct and unqualified. Not people who will eventually qualify as worshippers under the right conditions. Not people being newly invited into a relationship they have never had. My worshippers. Already, the category is established before any condition is named. And then, the daughter of my dispersed ones. Covenant language. A people scattered but not abandoned. Separated from a center but still in relationship with the one who established that center. The scattering is real. The text does not pretend otherwise. But the belonging is not revoked by the distance. The relationship persists through the separation. Will Gafney, in her academic work on this passage, has described Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10 as one of the most direct expressions of covenantal inclusion for a non-Israelite people in the entire prophetic corpus. Now, step back and look at all three passages together. Isaiah chapter 18, Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10, Psalm 68 verse 31. Three different books, three different centuries, three different prophetic voices, and across all three, a portrait that is consistent in a way that is difficult to treat as coincidence in literature as carefully constructed as the Hebrew prophetic canon. In Isaiah 18, a powerful people bring gifts to Zion voluntarily. In Zephaniah chapter 3, a people beyond the rivers of Cush are called God's own worshippers before anything else is said about them. In Psalm 68, this people hastens toward God with hands already stretched out, already reaching, already in motion before anyone gives the signal. Now look at all six figures and the institution we have traced throughout this video and ask whether you see the same thing. Ebed-Melech moved before anyone with institutional power was willing to move. The Cushite woman was present without requiring permission to be present. The Queen of Sheba initiated the journey before anyone invited her. Simon of Cyrene was at the center before anyone planned for him to be there. The Ethiopian official was already reading Isaiah chapter 53 before Philip arrived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church was already preserving ancient texts before the Western world thought to look for them. Every single one of them was already in motion before the surrounding world caught up. That is what the seventh pattern shows. And that is why it ties the others together. Not because it is a summary of them, but because it is the root from which all of them grow. The posture of reaching before permission. The orientation toward God before the surrounding world has made that orientation comfortable or officially rewarded. The hands already stretched out. Randall Bailey and Rodney Sadler, scholars whose work in African American biblical hermeneutics has been discussed and published in peer-reviewed academic contexts for decades, have both engaged this consistent portrait in the prophetic literature. Their scholarship does not claim racial supremacy for any group. What their work frames is a particular quality of orientation associated with this people across multiple prophetic voices writing across multiple centuries. A voluntary, urgent, initiated movement toward God that does not depend on external permission to begin. Now, I want to say directly what this seventh pattern is and what it is not. The history of racial theology on every side is full of the damage that claims of divine racial hierarchy have caused. This video has no interest in contributing to that damage. The seventh pattern is not a claim that one people is more loved by God than any other. It is not a doctrine of racial destiny. It is not an argument that any group stands above others in a hierarchy of divine favor. What the text frames, across these three passages and across everything we have examined, is a posture, a recurring, cross-century, multi-voice description of a people whose defining characteristic in the prophetic imagination is the direction they face and the urgency with which they move in that direction. Toward God, before permission, before comfort, before the world around them has made that movement safe or officially rewarded. Howard Thurman, writing in 1949, describes something he had observed across generations of the Black church under sustained pressure. A quality of spiritual directness that does not depend on comfortable circumstances. A refusal to let the structures of oppression become the final word about who you are or what you are capable of reaching. He was describing something lived out across centuries of a community holding on to faith at great cost. And what he was describing, without using these specific passages, is the posture that Psalm 68 calls hastening to stretch out her hands. The hands were already reaching before the comfort arrived, before the validation came, before permission was given, before the surrounding world acknowledged that the reaching was legitimate. That is the seventh pattern, the root from which the other six grow, and the one that makes this entire portrait coherent across 3,000 years of text. There is a version of church history that most American Christians received. It goes roughly like this. Jesus lived and died and rose again in Israel. The apostles spread the gospel outward. Paul carried it into Greece and toward Rome. The church grew through the Roman Empire. Theologians in Europe developed the core doctrines. The Reformation happened in Germany and Switzerland, and eventually Christianity arrived in Africa. That version contains real history, but it is missing something so foundational that once you see what is absent, you cannot recite the creed you recite or use the theological vocabulary you were handed without understanding them differently. The men who shaped the doctrinal foundations of the Christianity most Americans practice today did not do their work in Europe. They built their theology on African soil, in African cities, in African church communities, and that geographic reality is consistently underemphasized in how most Western Christians learn the history of their own faith. Before going further, something must be said with precision. North Africa in the Roman period was a cosmopolitan region with a diverse population that included Berber, Phoenician, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Jewish communities among many others. We cannot apply modern racial categories to ancient figures and expect accuracy. Claiming that these men would identify with a specific modern racial category would go beyond what the historical evidence supports. And this video does not make that claim. What this video does say, with complete verifiable accuracy, is that every one of these men did his formative work in North African cities. The theology they built grew from African soil, and that geographic reality belongs in how we understand the foundations of the faith. Begin with Augustine. Augustine was born in the year 354 in Thagaste, in what is now northeastern Algeria. He was raised in North Africa. After years of study and teaching across Italy, he returned to North Africa permanently. He served as Bishop of Hippo, a city on the northern African coast, for the last 35 years of his life. He built his entire life's work in North Africa. He died in Hippo in the year 430. His mother, Monica, widely understood to have been of Berber heritage, indigenous to North Africa, is one of the most celebrated figures in the history of Christian devotion. Her feast day is observed in the Catholic Church every year. Augustine wrote Confessions, one of the most widely read books in the history of Christianity. A work of spiritual autobiography, so searching and so honest that it has never gone out of print across 16 centuries. He wrote The City of God, a work of theological and political philosophy that shaped Christian thinking about faith and civic life for more than 1,000 years. He developed the frameworks around original sin, divine grace, and predestination that became central to both Catholic and Protestant theology. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. The theological movement that produced the Protestant Reformation drew directly and extensively on Augustine's framework. John Calvin built his understanding of grace and election substantially on foundations Augustine laid on the coast of what is now Algeria. The theological lineage of most Western Christianity runs through a man whose entire working life unfolded on North African soil. Now Athanasius. Athanasius was born around the year 296 in Alexandria, Egypt. He served as Bishop of Alexandria and became the most prominent defender of what would become Orthodox Trinitarian theology in the 4th century. And here is what that defense actually cost him. He was exiled from his position 5 times by emperors who preferred competing theological positions. 5 times removed. 5 times he went into exile. 5 times he returned. I want you to sit with that not as a historical fact to file away, but as a human reality. 5 times the most powerful political authority in the world told this man from Alexandria that his convictions were not welcome and removed him from everything he had built. 5 times he could have softened his position, found language that would satisfy the imperial preference, and stayed home. 5 times he chose exile over compromise. There is a question worth asking here. When you have been told 5 times that the institutions with power over your life have decided your convictions are not acceptable, and you return 5 times anyway, what is that? It is not stubbornness. It is the posture we have been tracing all along, already reaching, already oriented towards something that the surrounding structures cannot revoke, already in motion before anyone gives permission to continue. Athanasius against the world. That was the phrase that came to describe him. An Egyptian bishop who stood against imperial pressure and came back 5 times. The Nicene Creed. Still recited today by Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, and many other Christians around the world, reflects the theology that this man from Alexandria refused to abandon. Now, Tertullian was born around the year 155 in Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. He was among the earliest and most influential Christian theologians writing in Latin, and he gave Christianity a word used in virtually every church, in virtually every tradition, in virtually every language where the faith is practiced. He was the first writer known to use the Latin word trinitas in a Christian theological context. When you use the word Trinity, you are using a term introduced to Christian theological vocabulary by a man from Carthage in North Africa. The technical vocabulary Christians use to talk about the nature of God carries his fingerprints directly. And Origen. Origen was born around the year 184 in Alexandria, Egypt. He produced the Hexapla, placing 6 versions of the Hebrew Bible in parallel columns for careful textual comparison. One of the most ambitious scholarly projects in the ancient world. He developed methods of biblical interpretation that shaped how Christians read Scripture across traditions and centuries. His influence on how the Bible gets read extends to the present day, embedded in interpretive approaches that most readers encounter without ever hearing his name. Now hold all 4 together and feel what this actually means. The word Trinity comes from Carthage in Tunisia. The defense of Trinitarian orthodoxy that produced the Nicene Creed came from a bishop in Alexandria who returned from exile 5 times rather than compromise. The theological framework of grace and salvation that shaped the Protestant Reformation grew from the work of a bishop whose entire life unfolded in what is now Algeria. The systematic methods of biblical interpretation that inform how Christians read Scripture today came from a scholar in Alexandria. That is not a footnote to church history. That is the foundation of it. Built in African cities by thinkers whose work became the bedrock of a global faith, practiced today by more than 2 billion people. When you know this, you recite the creed differently. You use the word Trinity differently. You understand that the African contribution to Christianity is not something that needs to be argued for or added to the story as a supplement. It was already there, built into the foundations, present in the vocabulary, embedded in the doctrines, before the tradition that would later underemphasize it even existed. Let us look at everything we have traced together. 6 figures, 1 ancient institution, 4 theological architects, 3 prophetic voices writing across 3 centuries, and the word Cushite threading through all of it, connecting a geographic and cultural heritage to a series of recurring patterns that the ancient writers placed at the moments the story needed someone to act. The patterns are worth naming as living things rather than summarizing as a list. Ebed-Melech carries the first. The capacity to see what is actually happening when the institutions around you have chosen not to see it. To name it clearly in public. To move from that clarity even when every person with more authority has chosen something easier. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. The text kept his names. God noticed him personally. The Cushite woman carries the second. The capacity to exist in a space without requiring the space to validate your existence, a presence that draws from something the external structures of the room cannot grant and therefore cannot revoke. She never spoke in the passage. She did not need to. The text preserved that silence as dignity. The Queen of Sheba carries the third. The wisdom to arrive at the encounter with your own standard already formed. To apply it honestly. To update your estimate when the evidence demands it. To give from strength and receive on equal terms. She decided the conversation needed to happen and showed up prepared. Simon of Cyrene and the community he represented carry the fourth. The pattern of a people whose presence at the moments that matter gets recorded, carried forward, and woven into the continuing story. He did not choose his moment. The text refused to let him become a footnote. His name stayed. His son's name stayed. His community was at Pentecost and at Antioch, and in Paul's most significant letter, the Ethiopian official carries the fifth. The posture of searching before being found. Already reading Isaiah chapter 53. Already asking the right question. Already oriented toward the answer before Philip arrived. He went on his way rejoicing because what he received completed something already in motion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church carries the sixth, the faithfulness to preserve what the world chose to set aside. 1,600 years of continuous reading, ancient texts kept in a living language, a tradition whose antiquity was supported by physical evidence from the caves at Qumran, a church that is still standing right now. And 3 prophetic voices writing centuries apart carry the seventh, a people whose hands are already stretched out before anyone gives the signal, already moving toward God before the surrounding world has made that movement comfortable or officially rewarded, already reaching the root from which all 6 of the other patterns grow. These patterns are discussed and framed by scholars including Colin, David Goldenberg, Howard Thurman, Will Gafney, Randall Bailey, Rodney Sadler, Kathleen O'Connor, Edward Ullendorff, James Vanderkam, Michael Knibb, James Dunn, Walter Brueggemann, John H. Walton, and Umberto Cassuto, among others whose work is accessible and verifiable. They are traceable in the original languages, and they are present in the same Bible that has been available to you your entire life. Now here is what changes. Not in the abstract. In the specific, the first thing that changes is how you read your Bible. Not what it says. The text has not changed. But when the lens changes, you slow down at passages that used to move past you. You catch details that used to slide by without leaving a mark. You sit longer with certain figures. That change is permanent. Once you have seen Ebed-Melech clearly, once you have sat with the detail about the rags and understood what it reveals about who he was, you cannot unsee him. The second thing that changes is the story you tell about your heritage and your faith. For a long time, the dominant narrative presented the faith as something that arrived in the African American community through one specific channel, through slavery, through a tradition handed down by people who simultaneously used that same religion to justify what they were doing. That narrative accurately describes one channel. But the whole story includes an Ethiopian official heading south from a road near Gaza before Paul's first missionary journey began. It includes theologians doing their foundational work in African cities in the 3rd and 4th centuries, at a time when much of northern Europe had not yet encountered the faith. It includes a church in northeastern Africa with more than 1,600 years of continuous institutional existence. It includes the word Trinity coming from Carthage. It includes the Cushite woman standing present before God responded on her behalf. The faith did not arrive in Africa for the first time on a slave ship. The text does not support that. The history does not support that. And knowing the actual story changes how you carry your inheritance. The third thing that changes is what you expect from your religious community. You are entitled to ask whether the teaching you receive reflects the full picture the text contains. Not a politicized picture. The full picture. You can bring Numbers chapter 12 to your pastor and say, "I have been reading this carefully. I would like to talk about it." That is the basic act of bringing the text to the community and asking for honest engagement with what it says. Now here is what I want to ask you to do this week. 3 passages. Go to Numbers chapter 12. Read the whole chapter slowly. Stop at the repetition in verse 1. Ask why the writer said the same thing twice in the same sentence. Follow the conflict to its resolution. Ask whose presence God was protecting when the response came. Go to Jeremiah chapter 38 and read through to chapter 39. Verses 15 through 18. Follow Ebed-Melech at the pace he actually moved. Stop at the detail about the rags. Sit with what it means to act with that quality of care when nothing requires it, and no one is watching for it. Go to Acts chapter 8. Verse 26 through the end of the chapter. Read every detail Luke chose to include. The nationality named first. The specific text being read in the chariot. The question asked with honest humility. The direction traveled on the way home. The joy that was the last thing Luke recorded about this man. 3 passages. That is where the change in how you read begins. We started this video with a detail in the book of Jeremiah that has been sitting in plain sight for more than 2,600 years. A man in a pit. Mud at the bottom. A prophet disappearing. Everyone with institutional power, either ordering it or saying, "I can do nothing." And the one person who decided to act was African, who thought about whether the ropes would hurt, who carried old rags to the edge so the rescue would be gentle, who stood in a public place and used the word evil in front of the people who had done it. The Cushite woman is still in Numbers chapter 12. The Queen of Sheba is still in 1 Kings chapter 10 with her 120 talents of gold and her questions she arrived prepared to ask. Simon of Cyrene is still in Mark chapter 15 with his sons named. The Ethiopian official is still going home, rejoicing in Acts chapter 8. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is still reading in the ancient Ge'ez language texts whose antiquity the Dead Sea Scrolls supported. The word Trinity still came from Carthage. The Nicene Creed still reflects the theology an Egyptian bishop defended through 5 exiles and 5 returns. The framework of grace that shaped the Protestant Reformation still came from a bishop whose entire life unfolded on North African soil. None of this needed to be invented. None of it needed to be argued in from the outside. It was always there. In the text. In the history. In the foundations of the faith you were handed. The patterns were always present. The heritage was never outside the story, not added later, not argued in. There from the beginning, at the moments that mattered, named, recorded, acting, building, preserving, reaching, and seen by the God the text describes. Now you have read it clearly. Walk in it.